to, put any questions or comments or anything else like that in the chat. And also unmute yourself if you want to add to the conversation as it's going along, anything like that. We prefer to have, that conversation, that sort of thing. Um, I wanted to make sure that everyone knows that this is going to be recorded, and that we'll post both the recording and the slides in the member portal later this week or early next week, but it'll certainly be posted in the digest as well. So there'll be a link to that. So if there's anything that you missed, you can always check it out there. And as always, we'd love to see your smiling faces. So please feel free to turn your cameras on, although that's not required. But we always love to see those smiling faces out there. All right, so real quick, I'm just going to run through the agenda for today's webinar. We're going to talk about the purpose of the risk assessment, what things ought to be evaluated, what things ought to be included basically in your risk assessment tool, the use of the risk assessment data that you collect. And that's going to be, Lauren and I covering those first 3 points. And then we're going to turn it over to our state guests, Melanie from Michigan and Jill from Nebraska, to walk us through, not only their tool and their process, but also basically how they use their data as well. So, and then we'll do a wrap up with questions, time for questions at the end, as well as session evaluation. So, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Hugh. Hopefully, you're staying warm if you're in one of the cold places in the country. So, as you mentioned, we're going to talk about risk assessment. So, a risk assessment is the process that states use to identify potential vulnerabilities within an agency. It's used to analyze what could happen if there was a disaster that happened or some other hazards occur at that agency. There are numerous vulnerabilities to consider, and each vulnerability can have many possible scenarios happening within or because of it. The risk assessment is meant to be a tool that's used to help analyze these vulnerabilities and determine where an agency's level of risk falls, as well as how to prioritize how the state will address those risks or those vulnerabilities. Unfortunately, nothing will eliminate risk altogether. However, the state and the agency having good policies and practices can help reduce the likelihood of risk. So, per uniform guidance, states must evaluate subrecipients' risk of noncompliance within a subaward to ensure that the federal awards are being spent properly, that they are meeting the regulations and the terms and conditions that are lined out with either in the contract or the grant themselves. Since CSBG is an annual subaward, the subrecipients receive, states must conduct risk assessments annually to ensure compliance with the uniform guidance. So again, as mentioned, because it's an annual subaward, the states must conduct the risk assessment annually to ensure compliance. The risk assessment results help you identify where your agencies fall as far as the level of risk, so from high, medium to low, and it should inform who you monitor each year. The results not only help states determine which agency to focus on, but also helps justify why agencies are monitored more frequently. The size of an agency is one thing to consider. Staff turnover is another reason. So all of these come into play with why you monitor some agencies more than others. Questions about your monitoring schedule are also included in Section 10 of the state plan. This is where you're going to list your monitoring schedule based on the results of your risk assessment. So how do your risk assessment and your monitoring all tie together? Well, per the CSBG Act, you're required to monitor your agencies. So this includes ensuring that agencies are spending funds appropriately and complying with the terms and conditions outlined in the grant. There is a tendency to think of risk as control environments as matters of fiscal compliance, and that is important, but it's not the only risk. There's also a risk when it comes to your program's not doing as well as we would hope in accomplishing the goals of CSBG. The health of an agency's workforce, things like turnover, culture, opportunities, recognition, all add to layers of possible risk, and states should consider these while assessing risk. Um, Therefore, risk assessment and monitoring must look at successful program implementation, workforce health, in addition to the fiscal aspects of an agency. Again, the extent of frequency and type of monitoring will depend on the results of a risk assessment that's done at the state and will inform your monitoring schedule. So, state requirements. Some other things to consider when you're developing your monitoring schedule per the CSBG Act. You have to do a full on-site review every 3 years, an on-site review of newly designated agencies, other reviews as appropriate, and prompt follow-up with your CAAs if it's failing to meet any of the goals. I saw you came off camera or came back on camera, Hugh. Did you have something you wanted to add?
No, no. Thanks,
Okay.
Lauren.
All righty. Um, Now you know a bit about the purpose of the risk assessment. We're going to go into the more details about what to evaluate. So, uniform guidance does provide some suggestions on what to evaluate and what you should be evaluating. So, your prior experience, audit results, new personnel, and key staff are part of that. Um, uh, And it's super important to when you're doing your visits. This includes monitoring results and other programs from agencies you administer. So looking at all these in addition to some of the other things we're going to talk about on the next slide. So when conducting a risk assessment, there are several key factors to consider, and many of them can be grouped into some broader categories. So under your fiscal stability, some things to look at is the size and complexity of the grants, the size of the agency, the overall fiscal health, spending patterns, as well as single audit results. Generally, larger, more complex grants can increase risk, while having clean audits can show that there's strong financial practices which reduce some of the risk. Under management, some things to consider is your staff and the type of agency, as well as longevity of the management. So that includes your executive director, CFOs, the internal controls, procurement policies and practices, and document policies and practices in general. Strong internal controls and experienced leadership typically do lower risk. Governance and board compliance includes the tripartite board structure, engagement, meeting documentation, and oversight responsibilities. Performance and monitoring history look at past performance, prior monitoring results, corrective action, reporting timelines, progress toward any targets. A strong performance history lowers risk, and repeated findings obviously increase risk. And finally, some compliance and complaints and audits history are important indicators as well. So patterns of complaint, unresolved issues, recruiting, recurring audit findings may signal evaluated risk. So overall, these categories can help us systematically evaluate risk and determine where increased monitoring is needed or additional support may be needed. Scoring. So, accurate scoring is critical to an effective risk management. Risk scoring helps states determine the risk level of an agency and its severity. It also helps determine what type of action is needed. Do you need to do additional monitoring? Is some TNTA needed? Um, uh, the state's scoring mechanism can vary drastically across the board, and you'll see that, I'm sure, with Melanie and Jill. However, no matter the mechanism that's used, it should be used to assess impact or consequences that a risk may have on an agency and have a defined criteria for determining low, medium, or high risk, or what other terms you would like to use there. It should assess the quantity and quality of the risk. As we mentioned, eliminating risk is absolutely impossible, but it's important to identify, for states to identify what is acceptable level of risk for every circumstances. And so we've invited both Melanie and Jill to share their tools with us. And so you'll hear more about that later on. So on the screen now, you're going to see some areas of high risk for CAAs. Again, you're never going to eliminate risk entirely. So these are just some key areas to look at for financial management. There could be potential fraud or theft, unallowable expenses, internal control processes, governance, all things board related, meeting quorums, poor notes, etc. Um, uh, you have program performance as well as human resources. So again, that staff turnover and leadership. So that goes down to your board management, the tone at the top, ethical behavior, avoiding conflicts of interest. So is there any, oh, I see a question here. When an agency loses any federal funding or large federal funding is lost, should this be placed on high risk? And I would say yes, but with Melanie and Jill there, what are your thoughts?
I guess for me, it depends on if the grant was terminated for cause or if it was a grant that was expiring. I think the overall situation on why funding is lost, whether it be state or federal, would really drive that impact. So I use the information that you know in past monitoring reports to help determine that evaluation.
So I would say too, because if it's like they lost it because of fraud, then obviously you're going to want to go in and check your funding or just check CSBG. So
All
And
right.
and I'll just jump in here real quick, Naima. Obviously that piece of your risk assessment tool um, should evaluate that, and so it may be scored kind of highly or lowly, depending on how you score those things, as high risk in that particular area, right? But the overall risk assessment, because there are other factors that are involved in that, if that's the only piece of the risk assessment where they score as high risk, then the whole weighted piece may end up not being the agency itself may end up not being weighted as high risk because of other factors that are involved, right? Whether it's like these other things that you're seeing on the screen, right? So maybe they have great governance, they have great program performance, the human resources is solid, and their leadership team is still solidly in place. So some of those other factors may mitigate the other loss of a federal funding source for reasons other than fraud, right? They may rise to like a high medium depending on how you're scoring that, and it all depends on how you've crafted your risk assessment tool. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's very helpful, especially when we have 42 and we slate them out to do at least 14 every year. And so I wondered that if an agency had already been monitored within the last 14 and they had this funding loss, would that automatically place them higher risk, or would we still need to do another risk assessment when it came for their time? But I guess that's probably just an internal plan that we would have as a whole. Thank
Right,
you for
right.
your guidance on that, all of you.
Sure. Yeah, great question.
you might want to
Back
check
to
too,
you.
because sometimes like your state could have a policy. Like I know, like our policy says, every 3 years we'll be on site unless, and then there's like certain things, and one of those I think is if um, a big funding source is lost. So it could just depend on like what your state has as policies and procedures too.
Perfect. Thank you, Jill.
All righty. If there's no more questions, then I will pass it on to Hugh.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks, Lauren. Appreciate it. So, especially for folks in the room who might be like relatively new to this process, we thought it might be helpful to frame this whole approach or um, process of looking at the risk assessment, like kind of comparing it to how agencies look at their community needs assessment, right? So. Um, you can use the risk assessment results. In other words, so you do this process and you do it obviously for each agency, but for all your agencies, each year. And the point is to be able to look at the entire system, not just one agency at a time, to identify patterns and trends, maybe even systemic gaps in what you need to be looking at. So the data helps us to prioritize, actions, in the coming year, right? So where are we gonna, where and how are we gonna strategically prioritize our monitoring decisions? Now that might mean like who are we going to monitor this year, but not just who are we going to monitor, but how are we going to focus our monitoring priorities. Like when we go into a particular agency, where are we going to focus our time and effort, right? So are we going to do just a blanket monitoring, or are we going to focus on specific areas based on the information that we got out of that risk assessment tool, right? Additionally, like where do we need to allocate our uh, uh, TNTA resources? Everything is limited. We don't have unlimited discretionary funds. We don't have unlimited TNTA resources. So where's the biggest need, right? So going back to a needs assessment, right? So where's the biggest need to allocate those training and technical assistance resources? Tied into any of those things, you heard Lauren talk a little bit earlier about how some of this will inform our state plan priorities, right? Not just the monitoring schedule that goes into that, but also some other things that we might be able to speak to within there. So a TNTA plan, discretionary funding, any of those pieces that are tied into our plan. Um, and then there's the other piece about conceivably improving, policy and guidance, right? And then any other partnerships, improving partnership opportunities that would help us to mitigate any of the risk that we're seeing that's being identified in the risk assessment. So ultimately, the idea is it should help us help to ensure that we're uh, the best use of our limited, time, our focus, our funding, and capacity as strategically as possible. All right, so now what? So now we've done the risk assessment. We've identified areas of risk, agencies that might be rising to the level of high, medium, or low risk. Now we're going to need to determine how we're going to respond, right? So for your high to moderate risk agencies, that usually includes some level of differentiation in grant monitoring, some appropriate response that your office is going to take to help mitigate the risk that you're seeing. So some of that could look like additional reviews of agency documentation. So that might be a change in the way that you look at, those the monthly expense requests, right? Reimbursement requests. It could be changes in your fiscal or programmatic reviews, whether if you do like quarterly reporting, looking at those with a closer eye. Just anything that you can do to help you gain a better understanding of what's happening at the agency. You may be looking at modifying future statewide contracts to incorporate better controls. maybe you've identified that agencies struggle with submitting timely reports. And so you can change the contract to include maybe a monthly or quarterly submission, anything that'll help improve that process. But that may also require, additional TNTA to support that process. Um, any of these things, any actions that you can take to address what you're seeing as the source of the risk that you're seeing. Um, Now, if there's a history of compliance with the general or specific terms or conditions of the federal award, you specifically need to be trying to address that through TNTA support first, and then taking a look at the ability to meet those expected performance goals, and whether that requires an additional, excuse me, approach. Um, all right, so we've talked a lot about, how you might prioritize technical assistance for the agency or maybe even the entire network if you're seeing trends, issues that are common throughout a lot of these agencies when you're doing this uh, risk assessment and, across the entire network, right? So what pops out to you that should help inform your TNTA plan? So all of those things are kind of next steps for you. All right, so uh, the results should help inform the appropriate level of monitoring, as we spoke about throughout this presentation, especially for those high to moderate risk agencies and everything in between. So, like new agencies or those that are approaching the 3-year mark. And uniform guidance does specify the appropriate level of monitoring that states should be doing. We won't go over the specifics, but it's important to keep in mind when using the risk assessment data. Section E of uniform guidance also outlines how states may respond to the results of a risk assessment. And that includes, as we mentioned, providing training and technical assistance to support those agencies, conducting an on-site monitoring, of course, right? Ranging for agreed upon procedures or engagements as described in 200.425, and then also audit services. Pass-through entities may charge federal awards for the cost of agreed upon procedures or engagements to monitor subrecipients in accordance with Subpart D. And then the single audit act, and also those who are exempted from the requirements of the Single Audit Act and Subpart F. Um, so there are a number of steps that you can take to try to address the issues that you're seeing, and uniform guidance gives you a couple of suggestions on how you might address those particular pieces. All right, so having said all of that, I think it's now time to go ahead and uh, turn it over to our state spotlights, our state guests, to walk you through how they put all of these general requirements into place in their own state. So our first guest is Melanie Sanford. She's not only the state administrator with the state of Michigan, but she's also our board president. So if you'd welcome her today, and she's going to share her expertise in this particular area. Melanie, the mic's all yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Lauren and Hugh, for setting that up and for putting this together for us. I will say my first few slides are going to be a little bit redundant, maybe from what Lauren and Hugh have covered, but I think that it really stresses the importance of the risk assessment. So hopefully it's kind of a reinforcement for you. If you want to go to the next slide, we'll get started. So I want to just super briefly talk about community action in Michigan. We have 27 community action agencies serving 83 counties. We have, and that the slides that you'll get from this don't have the weird formatting so that you'll be able to see it a little bit better. But our annual CSBG allocation is just over $28 million. Our office also administers weatherization, water assistance programs, diaper assistance, energy assistance, and several other grants that total approximately $200 million annually with Michigan's Community Action Network. So I'm going to cover, like I said, I'm going to cover some of the points that Lauren and Hugh covered that will reinforce the importance of this, but also I'm going to talk about the ways that we specifically do some of our risk assessments that may give you ideas of your own as you're building your process. If you can go to the next slide. Risk it's managing to reduce the likelihood that an event will have an adverse effect on a project's goals. It's not just for fraud prevention or reacting to a catastrophe, and it's not just about financial issues. Risk kind of addresses performance and fiscal compliance. It's about events that may or may not happen. It's planning for the uncertainty. So what could go wrong with my program? When we talk about risk, it's important to remember that high risk does not mean that it's a bad program. Some programs are naturally higher risk because of the services they provide or the populations they serve. For example, programs working with vulnerable communities or delivering complex services often carry inherent risk. It's not a reflection of poor quality or performance. It's just simply the part of the nature of our work. Our goal in the risk assessment is to understand and manage these risks and not to label programs negatively. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So the risk management cycle is a framework for continuous discovery, analysis, action, and improvement. Risk assessment considers the relevance, the importance, incidence, and manageability of risk related to subrecipient performance and financial operations. The mitigation of risk is taking appropriate action to address potential problems, including imposing the appropriate types and levels of requirements, and provides appropriate types of monitoring and levels of technical assistance. And monitoring, oh, just one more quick, you're fine on this slide, but just monitoring is a process followed to assess how well a grant is being implemented, achieving the program objectives, and complying with the requirements, terms, and conditions of the grant. And throughout the entire cycle, every decision and every step must be documented. And then go ahead, Lauren, sorry. So risk assessment helps to prioritize and measure risks to focus on the most significant threats and opportunities within acceptable risk levels. It's not about eliminating risk entirely because, as Lauren had mentioned, total risk can never be eliminated, but instead it's the process that identifies and ranks risks based on defined tolerance and thresholds. And then in Michigan, we call our risk assessment is the STAR. It's the State Technical Assessment Report. And that's our risk assessment tool to systematically evaluate these results. So some factors that may be included in a risk assessment, and I think the next few slides maybe just are another kind of reinforcement of what we've covered so far. But the grant size, complexity, and grantee characteristics are some of the major factors. So larger or more complex grants generally carry higher risk, while smaller grantees also tend to be higher risk due to limited resources. And additionally, the type of organization matters. So public entities are typically lower risk compared to private ones. And then can you go to the next? There we go. So organizational maturity and internal controls are also significantly influencers for risk. Newer agencies carry higher risk due to limited experience, and alternatively, strong internal controls and well-structured management of our maybe older agencies reduce that risk. And effective internal controls ensure grant funds are used for their intended purposes, which is a critical factor in lowering our overall risk. Past performance and financial practices are critical indicators of risk. So, grantees with positive monitoring history and strong financial policies generally present lower risk. If they have documented procedures that are consistently followed, there is more assurance of compliance and reduction of potential issues. And sorry. And then audit history and complaint records are final topics that I'm going to cover with strong indicators for risk. Grantees with clean single audit opinions generally present lower risk. And alternatively to that, a history of complaints can increase the risk. And these complaints can come from clients, other funders, grantees, staff, board members, etc. So you have to kind of watch those as you're developing your risk assessment and tools to see like the nature of the complaints, where they're coming from, how frequent you're getting them. And all of these factors that have been covered help assess reliability and compliance when you're managing grant funds. Oops. Sorry, one second. Sorry. Risk assessment components will vary, but it's important that you use a method that consistently assesses the risk. So your risk assessment identifies categories of risk. So for example, what we've covered, the financial, programmatic, overall compliance. The risk assessment identifies risk indicators, typically those that are specific to a certain organization. It provides a scoring mechanism which weighs the most important risks and measures the individual entity's risk. It takes the score and identifies whether it's high, medium, or low risk. And then all of these elements should be developed by the state offices because uniform guidance in the CSBG Act and other federal guidance that requires us to complete risk assessments do not provide the specific guidance on how to do this measurement or to designate risk. So on the next slide, there we go. So this is what Michigan uses. These are our categories that we use in our STAR assessment, our risk assessment process. And these are also our most recent statewide averages that are aggregated. So you'll see the risk categories that we look at include financial stability, financial and quality management, board compliance, CSBG compliance. So that's going to cover like everything that's in the CSBG Act of what a CAA specifically needs to have, leadership and key staff, performance management and data, monitoring the single audit report, reporting and timely submission, and then complaints. So we look at all of those different categories. Each has a series of specific items that we look at and score per agency. So we do it per agency, not specifically per program, but we also make sure to include CSBG. We have a section for our weatherization grantees that also has like a, everything detailed with weatherization as well, so that we make sure to capture all of that relevant data, but the base of the STAR assessment is the same for all entities. If we can go to the next slide, we score risk based on impact and defined criteria for low, medium, and high risk. And when assigning scores, the focus is on the highest anticipated consequence of a risk. So the process uses scales to measure the impact, establishes criteria for risk levels. It determines what is considered an acceptable level of risk under different circumstances. And this helps to ensure a structured and consistent approach to evaluating both the quantity and quality of risks. And as I had said, so each area that we have has several different components under it. So this is an example of how we score the single audit section of our risk assessment. So this has four different things that we're looking at specifically. Some have much more. So some of them have up to, I think, 18 different things that we look at. But when we're looking at the single audit report, we score if it's if they've had findings, if they're financial, if the findings are programmatic, if there's been kind of back to the question we had at the beginning, a reduction or loss of funding and funding or programs, if there hasn't been any changes, or for a low risk would be strong funding may include increases or new programs. But during that, we'll also figure like why did they lose programs? And it might not be a high risk if it was because the program ended or, some factor outside of their control. And we also make sure that there's no, sorry, Lauren, that there's no findings in the last audit and kind of rank it based on that. So, and you'll see at the top, so high to moderate risk would get a 1 or 2 score, average to mild is 3 to 4, and a low risk is 5. So for us, 5 stars is the lowest risk. And on the next slide, so this is kind of complicated to look at, but this is an example of a financial stability. So we'll look at, like I said, the risk scale of 1 to 5, 1 being high risk, 5 being low. The criterion factor could be under financial stability, for example, we look at the size and complexity of their grants. So if there's several grants that are over $1 million annually with a lot of different requirements, that might be a higher risk than a smaller grant that has standard requirements. And then the size of the grantee, the overall budget, if it's over 5 million. And so there's a ton of different programs and a lot of different things and factors for each of those programs, they may be a higher risk than an agency that has a smaller budget, that doesn't have as many regulations. And like I said, this is only what we look at. This is only for the financial stability piece, but just kind of an example. On the next slide, this is how we quantify the risk using the completed risk assessment to determine an overall risk measurement or risk level. So this one, and on the screen, this is a little wonky of how it lined up, but where it says like financial stability is 5 items, that's going to be under criteria. So those are the number of items that we look at for each category that we score. So an example, I'll just kind of do the top one. So financial stability, we look at 5 different components under financial stability. An agency might have 15 total points based on that 1 to 5 scale, with 5 being the best. So we'll take 15 divided by 5 is 3. And we do that for each of our different categories. So for this specific example, the total score was 28.75, and divide that by the number of categories, and we have a 3.6, which is an average to mild score. So it's all formula based to quantify that component. So after our assessment is complete, the mitigation strategies may include adding additional checks and balance in accounting or program areas. We may modify future contracts to incorporate more controls, and providing additional training and technical assistance. And doing these things may help to manage that risk proactively rather than reactively, because we never want to be in a reactive situation. And the next slide, I just want to touch base on what our scores mean. So we provide this kind of definition to our agencies and include it in our policy. So it just goes on to show like if you're a score of 1 to 1.99, you have 1 star, you need improvement. And then we define like evidence shows a strong indication of many serious deficiencies. And then we define the serious deficiencies. Moderate is 2.0 to 2.99. Average 3.0 to 3.99. Good standing is 4.0 to 4.99. And excellent is 5. And with the way that our template and our formulas work is it's almost impossible actually to get a 5 based on the formula. But if an agency has, I believe, a 4.5 or higher, which is quite common, and they have not had any monitoring findings, no single audit findings, and have had previous higher scores on their star, then we will automatically bump them to a 5 to achieve that excellent status because it would otherwise be impossible with the way that the formula works out. So we have many 5-star agencies in Michigan, but a lot of the average I think right now is like it's in the 4s. So. And then we communicate our star results. So anybody on here that's in charge of the oversight with any probably state and definitely federal audits, one of the first items that's asked for, including monitoring reports, is also your risk assessments. They want to see the results. And how, like our single auditors, the first thing they ask for, they want to see risk assessments. They want to see the data that was used to develop and come up with the scores. And they want to see that we communicated with each grantee what their score was. So that's pretty much how every single one of our single audits starts. So we make sure to have these not only done timely, but consistently so that we have that documentation available as soon as it's asked for. So we just we wrap everything up from that each category into a letter. We provide some backgrounds of like how they did, like what they did well. If there's an agency that might have a lower score, we'll put notes in that to say, everybody on your financial team quit last year and you need, now you're rebuilding that and that is a risk that you have and we're going to watch it. Or we'll say you've got strong, financial oversight and all of your reporting has been done timely. So we like to tell them what they did really well and tell them also the areas for opportunity to help mitigate future risk. And then we document, I think did we might have skipped a slide, Lauren. Maybe not. I'm missing a slide then. I'll just cover then. We document our process because, like I said, it's part of every audit and monitoring we have. We we include all of the phases of our risk assessment process, including monitoring policy that defines the process. We have our risk assessment tools and any updates that includes criteria, factors, risk scale, and the level calculation we use. We have documentation of each completed risk assessment with the level of risk for each grantee on file, all of the support documentation that we use to complete that, a monitoring plan that includes a monitoring schedule, any assessment reports to our grantees, all of the monitoring reports for programmatic, financial, organizational standards, and then we have weatherization has separate in addition to all of those. So some agencies, and in Michigan, we do programmatic. We have a programmatic monitoring team. We have a that only looks at program stuff and like CSBG compliance. We have a financial monitoring team that looks at the overall financial stability and like transactional type work. And then we have an organizational standards team. So we have somebody who's like who does org standards. So it's those three teams are all separate. So an agency will get different reports for each of those things. And then any management decision letters and follow up and then close out. So we keep all of that on hand so that we have a clear audit trail when we are audited. And I will note it's been a couple years since we've had an OCS audit, but when we had our last one, the process that we used for risk assessments was noted as exemplary, and they've actually sent I think other states to us for guidance on this process. And we've had states, some of you on this call may actually use our risk assessment template because it's been shared with several states over the years as kind of a baseline to be adopted for some that did not have one in place. So um, we do have a strong risk assessment process that you may or may not use now or some form of it. And then monitoring and the risk assessment. So periodic monitoring will ensure that grantees spend funds appropriately and comply with the grant terms. And then the extent, the frequency, and the type of monitoring should align with what your office's policy is. Ours is determined ultimately by the level of risk identified during that assessment. So if we have an agency that's a score 5, we're not necessarily going to dig in as much as we will as one that's got a lower score with a higher risk, especially if it's in like financial. Then our financial team, when they do their review, they're going to make sure to watch, if it was because their financial policies weren't being monitored, being followed. Our financial team is going to make sure that they start following their internal policies to make sure that they mitigate any risk. Or if it was because single audit findings were repetitive from in many years, then our financial team will make sure that they pay more attention or that we can help them mitigate and clear up those risks. Or if our programmatic team sees that they have 3 board vacancies that are over 90 days old, they're going to work with them, knowing that the risk assessment identified this, and they'll help the agency that way as well. And then finally, risk assessment data is valuable beyond monitoring because it will inform training and policy improvements. So insights from the process can unveil common risks along with similar or among similar agencies. It will highlight to us what's confusing or poorly implemented policies and identify issues stemming from our state level policies. So this will allow us as state offices and our entities to proactively address those systemic problems and strengthen the overall program performance. And I think, is there a slide, Lauren, of how the data is used outside of monitoring? I think my slides might have gotten mixed up. Overall, though, our agencies are in good standing. So when we do have one that may present a higher risk, we may have more in-person meetings with them. We'll do more focused trainings, or we'll take other modified approaches based on their specific situations to ensure that they get back on track, because their success is our success. So we want to make sure that, like I said, that we're proactive and not reactive with the way that they're operating. So with that, I will pass it to Jill, I think. Or do I pass it back to you, Hugh?
Nope, Jill is fine. Thanks so much,
No.
Melanie.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. Your information was so good. Ours is opposite. Yours like good was higher, ours good is lower for numbers. So, um, okay. I'm Jill Giles, the CSBG program coordinator for the state of Nebraska. And just a little bit about Nebraska. We have 9 community action agencies, and they're all private. And I am the only CSBG staff member, and I'm located in the capital. I added a little star to our state so you could see where that was. So, um, for our risk assessment, we've actually kind of updated things just this year. So, with our risk assessment, I didn't update, but like what we do with it, we updated, and our monitoring plans we updated this year. So I just wanted to kind of show what our tool looks like and what kind of questions it looks at. So we have 2 sections, programmatic and financial or fiscal, and we complete them every year, usually in um, April, May, as I'm preparing to start the subawards, getting them all prepped to start in October. And this tool is different. The rest of the state has to use a specific tool, but I got special permission to use the tool we had because I feel like it's um, the normal state tool is more financial focused only, and ours focuses on both programmatic and financial, um, which helps us then to monitor. So, yeah, so the first 2 questions are programmatic, which is important of how long has the agency executive director or CEO been there. That's just important because of experience. Sometimes, and it also depends, like, did they come from the actual agency or are they like an outside person that came in? And then that can just help, if they are new with your monitoring and your training and technical assistance, you will uh, design it more for especially those people just starting off. I like with EDs or community service directors, anybody that's like new to the CSBG world of agencies, I like to kind of have like a CSBG 101, like basics kind of meeting with them at first. And then as the year goes on, check in on them, like, because there's a lot of requirements for our funding, and sometimes it's not a lot of funding for places. So just checking in, I think that's always important to know. And then I just look at their board of directors. Do they have all their board members? Or if not, then there's a scale of, like I said, ours, the better score is 1 or 0, up to 5, I think is the most it goes. Okay, then going on with the board of directors, we have the agencies provide a quarterly board monitoring that they submit quarterly. The board monitoring gives me information about when they meet, when the board meets, all of their board members and what sections they're in, and then it'll say like if there has been a vacancy. So that's important that they submit that. Um, and then uh, that's also then where I can, look at, okay, if they're either not submitting this in time or they're not filling board vacancies, what can I do to help? Hopefully before your risk assessment, you know that an agency is having problems filling a board position, but it's just a good idea, yearly to be like, oh, hey, they've, had some issues on and off and on. Let's see if they need some sort of governance training or something. And then their org standards, we base that, then the two, so if I see that they're getting a not very good score in that area for their monitoring, I would determine if maybe I need to look at more, because in Nebraska we only check 20 of the standards every year. I try to do 20, like a different 20 every year, so that within 3 years I've checked them all. Just because it's not possible to check them all. I don't know. I know some states do, um, but we also check, like, if an agency didn't meet one last year, we check it again this year. Or if the agency self-proclaims they didn't meet something, we check it. So, yeah, that just gives us a little bit more knowledge there. And then the next part of the risk assessments, their annual report. I would say that's probably where most of our agencies usually need some help. And so we just check, like, clients served, has the amount decreased a lot. This, of course, changed a lot in, what would it have been, 22 to 23, like when they went from having cares to not. So things like that, you just kind of have to know, obviously, understand why there was a major difference. But and then also with the annual report, we look at, like, did they meet, how much of their NPIs did they meet? Did they have any issues submitting their annual report? And so then with those NPIs, like, do we need to do TTA around targeting, or maybe it's just that their staff are having issues remembering to submit the information on the database, or whatever we need to do. That's kind of when we look at that area. And then the last area of the programmatic, which I think is on the next slide, is just training compliance. If there's any required trainings we've had for the year, did they attend them? Because usually there's only maybe one or two a year that we require them. And the only reason we require them is because it's on something that is like a OCS requirement, like the annual report or something like that. Then we require someone to be, but we usually do it virtually or in person, or in person. So, and then our financial part of the risk assessment. And this part is kind of new too. Oh, I guess I missed the other programmatic monitoring. That's just like, that kind of helps you to know. We have them send in, like, when Head Start monitors them or any other programs, just so that you can kind of see, like I said, if, they would lose Head Start funding or weatherization funding or something, due to a reason that's going to cause a red flag, then you're going to want to probably check in on that agency after you get that. Okay, so now the financial. Again, how long that director's been there, the financial director. I think that's important. The same reason for the executive director. For how much help they may need along the year, it kind of like lets you know. And just starting this year, before I had to do programmatic and financial everything for CSBG, but we just had a team that's starting to do a lot of the financial reviews and things. So this assessment also kind of helps them to see, since they have no idea anything about our agencies, it helps them kind of know to agencies they need to check in on, or if there's any issues or anything. The rest of the financial, there's the budget. That's just important. If if an agency's funding is coming from CSBG, most of ours are not, but there is one And then just our reports submitted on time, like their monthly payments, we also have quarterly reports. And then, sorry, I'm skipping ahead, Lauren. And then we have, we look at their single audit, like, did they have any findings, material weaknesses, deficiencies, that sort of thing, and give them a score on that. And then we also, if they would have a pending litigation, we would put that on the score. So then I think it's one or two ahead from that. Well, yeah. Then this kind of gives them scores of kind of a total and then fiscal and programmatically um, what their score is. And then new this year, which I sent because I realized I should maybe should have put it on here, but we have this new monitoring report. We used to do monitoring, we just kind of had like a blanketed monitoring program, and we would say like, um, if you scored between these levels, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But we've actually now created individual plans for each agency. Um, some agencies are very similar to other agencies, but at least it gives a breakdown of it kind of looks like a contract, but it's like this is what the agency is going to do for the year for to provide to us for review, and then what we're going to do for review. So something new we've added is besides the plan is just more specifically being like looking at the risk assessment and did they have issues with the org standards? Okay, let's look at a couple more. Or are they having issues with the annual report? Can I work with my state association to get them some help on targeting, or do I need to reach out to like NASCSP or somebody, national partner, to help with that sort of thing? In Nebraska, we subaward with our state association, and they help with system administrator for the database and like a lot of the data things for the state. And then they also complete training and technical assistance if it's something outside of really specific things that I can do. If it's kind of like a overall, like the whole state kind of wants a training, they will do that for me. So if there was something like that, I would put that on this new monitoring plan that we have. And what else do I want to add? Oh, we just recently added, we're going to do like programmatic reviews of like case files and making sure that CSBG, like the allocability of things are correct. So that will be fun to do new this year. So let me just make sure, I think. And two, after or before, after I do a risk assessment, if I see there's going to be a high need with an agency, I'll also try to get their input of like, hey, you really struggled with the annual report this year. What can I do? What can we do to help? Or, whatever area they're struggling with. I try to also like get the agency's input too. And I did not mention, but like I think I said before earlier, not with my thing, but we do visit agencies every 3 years, but we also, at least every 3 years, but we also do if they have a new ED within 180 days after their first year. And then like if there's a issue, we kind of leave the third one it's kind of generic. So if there's a reason, or if maybe you are following up on an issue you saw the year before, just to leave that leeway if you need to be able to complete that. So I think that's it that I had for mine.
Well, thank you both. Appreciate your in-depth coverage of the risk assessment tools in each of your states, as well as what you do with them. I think we've got a little bit of time here for questions, if anybody has any, either for Lauren and I here at NASCSP or for Melanie or Jill. We'll wait a few minutes. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Looks like you all might be safe. Y'all did very in-depth reviews of your tools and processes. I really appreciated that. Looks like we're clear, right, Lauren? Are you seeing anything? I'm not.
Nope, I don't see any.
Okay, all right. Then what do we have here? Looks like we've got a slide with some resources. You'll see these slides when we when we post them either on the member portal and or in our digest next week. But we have a number of peer risk assessment templates. So as a member, you just need to use your login. Remember to use your login to get to the member portal side of the of our website. But we have a number of those. And then on the non-member side, we also have some tools under the state management work group tab. The previous work group put together some work that on monitoring that includes some risk assessment templates in there. And then there's also this IM on risk assessments. It's getting to be a little bit old, but it's helpful in getting OCS's perspective on it. So those are the resources that we have on the website. So we just I'd like to take a minute to say thank you for joining us, but especially thank you to Melanie and to Jill for sharing their expertise and their tools and their process and how they do it. And so just if you would take a minute to scan the familiar evaluation and let them know how we did. And with that, hope you all have a good rest of the afternoon and a rest of the week, and enjoy your weekend. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.